Welcome. My name is Professor Kshitij Kapoor, and this is a special episode of our recent series, Life Beyond Coronavirus, The Expert View. Now, as many of you would know, we had ended this series 2 weeks ago. We thought that all that had to be said about COVID was said, and it was time to now focus on recovery. Well, the virus had a mind of its own. Melbourne and Victoria are isolated from the rest of the country, the rest of the world, as we move back into stage 3 restrictions. And many of you wrote to us and asked, what is the expert view on this? So here we are, joined by 3 world-leading experts to answer your questions. Why did we get here? But more importantly, how do we get out of here? What is the way out of this new lockdown? To answer this question, joining me today are 3 experts. Professor Sharon Lewin. She is the inaugural director of the Peter Doherty Institute. She's an infectious diseases specialist and a basic scientist. Professor Tony Blakely. He is an epidemiologist and a public health expert and the director of the Population Intervention Unit at the University of Melbourne. And finally, Professor Cathy Humphreys. She's a social work practitioner, as well as the co-chair of the Melbourne Alliance to End Violence Against Women and Their Children. Joining me today, all 3 of you, let me ask you the first question. Sharon, what is the most important consideration as we look at our way out of this lockdown?
I think the most important consideration is how to make sure that every Victorian has a role to play here. Every Victorian has a role, has a opportunity to make a contribution, and we need every single person to play their part.
We'll come back to what the every Victorian has to do. Tony, from your point of view, coming out of this lockdown, what is the most important consideration?
Embrace the lockdown, go hard. We might achieve elimination if we take this seriously. Elimination will be a much better world to live in rather than this yo-yo suppression, lockdown, back, forth.
All right, we're coming back. So you're in the elimination camp, and Cathy, from your point of view, as a social
I'd love
worker.
elimination, but
Okay.
I guess if we're going to do suppression, we need to do suppression smarter.
Okay,
And so I think the last
every
round's brought out.
Victorian, elimination, smarter suppression, we're going to come with. But let's look at the facts first. Sharon, we had ended this lockdown, our Life Beyond Coronavirus series. The AFL was going to start. We were back in restaurants. There were guests at home. And here we're in lockdown again. And if we look at the graph, there you can see Victoria peaking again. But the big difference you can see is that previously there was that blue element. That was the imported cases. And now it's all red, which is local transmission. How did we get here?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the other point from the graph is it's clearly a second peak and it's much higher than that first peak. We got here largely because the virus got into our community when we were not expecting it to be there. And it got into our community largely through breaches in quarantine. So the entry point was from return travellers, but it was spreading. And it was, what happens with the virus is it spreads silently for the first week, essentially. And especially if it's spreading amongst young people often don't get symptoms. So I suspect it was spreading for a bit longer than a week until we started seeing clusters linked to these breaches in quarantine. And although we had awareness coronavirus was around, we hadn't gone back to normal life. Restrictions had relaxed, but actually people had really probably gone back to normal life. There were many of us would have known there was not much social distancing, even in our own families, let alone other much larger family gatherings. So I think we learnt that what we were doing when restrictions relaxed is not how we will live with coronavirus. It is not enough to stop these intermittent entries into our community.
So you're almost suggesting that from that blue, it's spilt into the red, and then the red just sort of accumulated by itself through what we did. But if we look around the world, is it really possible to keep this so low? Because, you look at Korea, in South Korea, it's the young people going to the bars that, led to another spike. It's spiking in Switzerland. Now, these spikes haven't overwhelmed the country, but they're like our spikes and lead to more restrictions. Is this the way it's going to be?
If you look actually at our data, you'll see the first wave, as we saw before, and the second wave, and you have this sort of bubbling along of low-level detection of infection. I do think it's possible to maintain that. Ideally, it would be great to eradicate it, as 6 out of 8 states have done. But I do think other countries can do it. It's tough though, and I do think we have to start perhaps shifting our thinking around personal responsibility for this, as well as government-induced changes. And our personal responsibility is how we live day to day. And how we live day to day involves now, for us in Victoria, mask wearing where possible, social distancing, hand hygiene, all those things that we've talked about. I think we need to shift our thinking a bit more to the personal responsibility that each of us have. Now, if you look around the world, you're right, many countries are experiencing these second waves. A lot of it's related to how quickly they're opening up. I think we actually did open up relatively slowly, but if you look at Israel, for example, it was doing very well, opened up pretty quickly, and bang, 1,000 cases a day in a country of 9 million people. California was doing, the US is...
I was going to say, let's not even go
let's not even go to the US, but California also opened up and had this big resurgence. But other countries, Korea, you're right, have had outbreaks, but they're bubbling along in the low hundreds. You need an outstanding public health system to keep this under control, unfortunately.
We do. Now, Tony, you've been observing and commenting on this quite a while, and I've been actually observing your comments for quite a while. And in March and April, you actually raised everyone's attention to the fact, when everyone was talking about flattening the curve, you said, folks, you're just not flattening the curve, you are really squashing the curve. And you raised at that point in the question, is it elimination that we're going for? And at that point in time, I thought you weren't so sure whether that was possible or desirable. But I've seen your views evolve. Tell us why you think it's now possible and desirable.
So I've been very careful in this pandemic to offer advice and comment on all options, but about a week ago I came off the fence to argue for elimination. So with the elimination, it would be a better option than living in a world where you're constantly going into lockdown after lockdown. And since March, April, we've seen New Zealand achieve it, 6 out of 8 states and territories in Australia achieve it, Taiwan, similar population to Australia, achieve it. It's not guaranteed, but if we could achieve elimination, it would put Australia into a position where we were in a nice holding position. We could see what's happening around the rest of the world. We could either wait for the vaccine, or if the vaccine's taken a while, we could pivot to letting the virus back in once we've got better treatments that are under control. The issue at the moment is, and another reason I came off the fence now, is that we're in a 6-week lockdown. So we might as well make really good use of it and see if we can increase the chances of eliminating. Nothing's guaranteed here, but if we were to go hard for 6 weeks, we'd probably have a better than 50-50 chance of eliminating.
Now, look, no one would disagree that elimination would be a desirable option. The problem is the price of achieving it. And the price of achieving it comes in 2 ways. It comes in a harder lockdown and perhaps even a longer lockdown. And no one can give you a promissory note. No one can say, do this 6 weeks, you'll have it. So tell us, how much harder would the lockdown have to be?
Okay, so first of all, this is really hard decision making. It's weighing up probabilities. So I think we could get to more than a 50% chance of achieving elimination if we go harder. What would that look like? It would look like the following. Mandatory mask wearing, or at least strongly encouraged whenever you're in an indoor environment that you can't avoid and you've got close proximity. So that's supermarkets and particularly public transport. Tightening the definition of essential workers. So basically, why are department stores still open? Why do we need to go and buy our shoes at the moment? Those things should be shut down for the duration of the 6-week lockdown. Schools closed, tick. That's been done other than year 11 and 12. Schools, kids don't get too sick as a rule, it's always an exception, but they still transmit. The virus comes into another child, back to another family. Those are the sorts of things that we need to be doing. But above that is leadership. We know from the New Zealand model that with Jacinda Ardern and other people saying, we are going for elimination, we cannot guarantee it, but this is the plan. And beneath that would be transparency with an advisory group that is advising the Chief Health Officer in Victoria every week, open transparently so Victorians can see it. With options for stopping going for elimination if it gets out of control. We're not just going to beat on that drum, but so that there's transparency about this and we really give it a good go.
All right, and then how long do you think it needs to be?
That's a great question. It changes day by day. 5 days ago, based on the numbers then, the modelling that we're doing with other University of Melbourne experts would suggest that we could perhaps have a 75% chance of achieving elimination at the end of 6-week lockdown,
Right.
with really strong measures. But as each day ticks by and we've had things, and this virus, it plays out in all sorts of ways and just does this thing. So now that it's in a few hospitals and spreading that way, that probably lessens the probability, but it's still probably at least 50-50 on it. And it's each day we need to keep updating that, which is why, Shatij, I come back to the need to have an advisory group that is reporting on this frequently.
But you know, you don't also want a running commentary. A society can't live with a running commentary that every morning you wake up and say, oh, they're saying elimination today. And they say, no, it's suppression today. You know, there needs to be some consistency.
Well, why not? Why can't we say? Let's imagine let's assume these caseloads are going to go down in about 2 or 3 days once the lockdown's been in place for at least 7 or 10 days at the moment. What's wrong with Premier Andrews coming out and saying we're going for elimination? We will revise this on a regular basis, but now we're going for elimination and we'll let you know if we stop that. Right. But actually set the goal high now and you can retreat from that if necessary.
Okay, well, you raise a good point, but you know, all of these lockdowns and the roller coaster of all of this is a tremendous impact on people's lives, and that's where we turn to you, Cathy. The results are coming in from what has happened in lockdown 1. What do we know about the impact of that on families, on women, on children?
So I think that what we're seeing is that it's brought out the best and the worst. So in terms of the best, so let's start with the best. In terms of the best, you know, I think there's been a lot of looking out for each other. You know, we've seen, you know, a real kind of resurgence of community looking after each other, and an idea that actually physical distance doesn't mean social distance.
Right.
So, you know, I think there's been some strong messaging about that, and I think people have been pretty proud of what we've been doing in Australia. In fact, you know, we're really good at public health in Australia. You know, if we're often ahead of the curve. So that we've got lots of models of how you do public health in Australia. You get behind the health experts. You know, we were the first around seatbelts, compulsory seatbelts, around breath testing, around smoking, around cycle helmets, bicycle helmets, backyard fireworks. You know, when the public health people get behind something and the government goes with them and you bring the community, we've got a really good carrot and stick stuff.
All right, so
that we do well.
That's the carrot part. We've done that well, but where is
and then the nasty stuff is really, you know, you can always play to the tropes in the community around racism, around seeing the fact that there's a paradox within this, which is that, yes, coronavirus can happen to anyone, but it actually happens much harder on vulnerable people.
Right.
So that the inequalities in our society are really heightened and brought to the surface in ways that just show, in a way, how unequal our society is.
You know, inequalities are sometimes these abstract things, but when they become localized or focal, like towers, you know, it suddenly crystallizes in everyone's mind. Now, I think you live close to some of the towers that have been needlessly sort of stigmatized. Tell us what it's been like there.
So I think, you know, you can't help but, you know, particularly when it went into the hard lockdown, you know, your heart just sank. You think, you know, that's a terrible thing to do to many of those people who, you know, many of whom have been in prison at different stages of their lives, you know, have had terrible experiences, and they came to Australia in a way as a place of sanctuary. And so doing this hard lockdown, I think, was very, very confronting. And I think confronting for everything. Now, again, you know, there were traffic jams around the towers with people bringing in food and goods and, you know, people just went, how can we support you? This is terrible. On the other hand, I think we didn't do the disaster and the crisis response well enough. You know,
you just lauded our public health system, and I'm sure that the politicians would have thought about it. The reason they did react to lockdown is because the public health experts must have said, there is great vulnerability here, please seal it off. So was there a different way we could have done this?
I think that if you're going to seal something off, then you actually have to bring in the crisis, have the whole kind of disaster. We have got ways of doing disaster and responding to a crisis, and we didn't do that well enough. There should have been, it was clear that people were without food, mothers and babies didn't necessarily have all the milk that they needed, all sorts of things were happening that were going wrong. And in a really good crisis response, you would have better logistics. It's a very pragmatic, logistical exercise to respond to a crisis, and I don't think we did the crisis response well enough. I guess in terms of inequalities and how they hit, my specialist area is around domestic violence and child abuse, and you can see that while this is a really important public health issue to be locking down and to be trying to suppress or eliminate, actually the other public health issue, domestic violence is a public health issue.
So to tell us about one hears a lot. Give us a sense of the magnitude of how the lockdown is impacting issues of domestic violence.
Well, I think that we've just had a really important study come out from the Australian Institute of Criminology. 15,000 women were surveyed. 50% of those are cohabiting women, and for them, we were seeing actually very high levels of physical and sexual assault or coercive control being reported. So 8.8%.
Nearly 1 in 10.
Nearly 1 in 10, yeah.
And these people are now captive in some sense.
They're now captive, you see, so that you see, of course, domestic violence abusers love isolation. It's almost like the coronavirus, And so, there's a paradox here about how affected and impacted women and children have been who are living with domestic violence. So that about 2/3 of those women who were reporting domestic violence were saying it either started, about 1/3, it started, and for 2/3 it was getting worse, escalating. So, really bad.
So look, Tony, you said this is difficult, but what we'll need to do is find a balance. Find a balance between what's the optimal, balance of health, of the economy, but really of our lives in many ways. So Sharon, when you put all of this together, I realize balances are difficult, and you see us coming out of this lockdown, let's say in about 6 weeks. What do you think is achievable and should be our target from a health perspective?
Our target should definitely, right now we have this urgent need to reduce new infections, and that's going to heavily dictate policy. Now, if we bring down the curve, if we start seeing declines,
like 200 a day, what would be down?
And we get down to 10, 9, 6, 5, bubbling along. Then the next discussion will be, can you get to 0? That's going to be tough. And can we open up our borders? I think the real tricky thing for Australia right now is that we are the only state, maybe New South Wales, maybe, rapidly changing situation there, but the rest of the country has effectively achieved elimination. And we can't function without our internal borders open, let alone our external borders open. So those discussions need to come. Now, I just want to get back to something about the towers, though. I don't think we have done enough really top-notch community engagement. So we had a period between those two peaks when we knew about vulnerabilities. We'd seen what happened in Singapore. We don't have a Singapore situation here with migrant workers, 300,000 migrant workers in dormitories. But we do know about vulnerable people. We've been very conscious about Indigenous populations and some very active engagement there, and we've had a very pleasing outcome so far. But we haven't done that with migrant communities and other vulnerable populations. And had we had that community, it's very hard to do community partnership in an emergency, but we had a bit of a breathing period. So I think we have to focus on that. And so many of the community leaders from the towers came out very cooperative and are fantastic role models and influencers within their communities. And we need to work that better. I was recently actually attending an international meeting on COVID from my lounge room, actually. But it was a great, really good meeting.
Is going to be. Even international travel is now going to be on your TV screen from your lounge room.
But I took a few days off work so I could actually immerse myself. The International AIDS Society ran a meeting on COVID, and they had the head of WHO, the head of UNA, the head of the UN, Bill Gates, you know, all the Tony Fauci. But one of these speakers was a very prominent researcher in South Africa, and he was talking about what happened in South Africa, where they did a very strict lockdown, ridiculously strict lockdown. They had no infections. People were basically starving. They couldn't go to work. There was no social security. Terrible. Then they let it go, and infections just recurred.
So that's a good segue to you, Tony. You have very carefully moved to the position, as you said, that perhaps elimination should be the goal. You would have noted, I noted this morning that Nick Coatsworth, our Deputy CMO, said that was a false hope. I think Greg Hunt clearly differentiated himself, said that's not the goal. Why do you think people are stepping back from what at one level seems like, you know, the simple, straightforward thing to shoot for?
I don't think it's that stepping back. I think there's path dependency. So if we go back to the beginning...
Now you have to make that simple. You said this is not stepping back, this is path dependency.
All right, let me do it again. Let me do it again.
What do you mean there?
I don't think this is stepping back. I think this is because the initial position based on influenza pandemic was that elimination was not possible in the initial plans. And the federal apparatus, so the Canberra-based group here, have said the whole way along, Scott Morrison, Paul Kelly, Brendan Murphy, that suppression is the way to go because elimination is impossible. So that's their vested point to some extent. Now, I know I'm being provocative saying this, but if you also look at the last 4 months, you'll see that the states behaved and spoke more in terms of elimination. And 6 out of 8 states have achieved it. The 2 states that haven't are the ones with the greater population density. Yes, I get it. New South Wales and Victoria, it's going to be a harder achievement to make that. But as Sharon just said, we've got a real problem here. Australia is split in 2 between the states that have eliminated and those that haven't. Now, I don't expect the other 6, 8 states and territories will want to concede and accept the virus back and now they're there. Therefore, whilst we've got this lockdown, I think the onus is on Victoria to give it a go to see if we can join the rest of Australia on their terms.
Right. Now, when I looked at some of your recent publications, you know, face masks seem to play a very important role. Now, I have to be very honest, I'm very confused about face masks. First, to me, as just a general person in the public, it was self-evident you should be wearing face masks. We wear face masks even when you're spraying paint. But we said, no, there is this epidemic going on, but you know, there's not enough evidence for virus, no, don't really wear the face mask. Now, in certain countries, of course, and you look at the ones who've gotten the best responses, face mask has always been a part of what they do. So tell me first, why was the science of this so complicated when it seems so straightforward? And secondly, what's the cultural aspect here? I think there is something deeply cultural about face masks.
So there's a bit to say here. So the science of it was largely based on healthcare settings and not in community settings, and it wasn't clear. And I think that's a real problem with policy making, is if the evidence isn't there, we assume there is no evidence. And that's not the way you make policy when an urgent situation is upon you. Okay, but now things have moved. Lancet last week, major systematic review, mask wearing reduces transmission by 85%.
85%?
Yeah, now I think that's too much because these were observational studies, so they weren't randomized trials. So it's probably a bit overstated, but it won't all be due to healthier people more likely to use a mask. So let's assume it's somewhere between 60 and 80% reduction. Now that reduction there was no difference between that in the healthcare setting and the fewer studies that were out in the community, although there weren't that many of them. But we know from the East Asian experience, the countries using the mask have had a better ability to control it. Now, let's assume it's somewhere between 60 and 80% reduction. That's a benefit to the person wearing the mask, I won't get it, but also means if I've got it, I won't transmit it. And a lot of things in public health, you can get a positive spiral here. By the more people wearing masks, you just cut those chains of transmission. So in the modelling I'm doing with Jason Thompson, Mark Stevenson from the University of Melbourne, we see that mask wearing at about an 80% reduction really does increase the chance of elimination. So that is an important facet.
I think to most people listening, that would seem, well, yes, but why are we hearing about it now? Sharon, why do you think, what's the cultural element here? Why has it taken us so long to embrace something that is so cheap, straightforward, simple, easy to explain?
Well, I think that first of all, there were mixed messages at the start and the science has changed. And I think the big advantage of masks for coronavirus is that when people can be infectious when they're asymptomatic. So if you have universal mask wearing, you reduce the risk. I think I'm a basic scientist and clinician. I don't know the social reasons. I think the West, this is just hypothesis, there's sort of this perception of people look vulnerable in a mask, or they have this idea that it's scary, it makes you look scared and vulnerable. Well, when I speak to my Asian colleagues, they say to me, what's the big deal? What are you all fussing about? You wear a mask.
Look at the world's two great presidents. You know, President Xi, right from the beginning, doesn't mind being seen in a mask. President Trump will say not too much about it. Cathy, what do you think, from a community point of view, what would it be if all of us started wearing masks?
Well, I think just it's obvious, isn't it, that it's going to make a difference. And if we're heading for doing suppression smarter or going for elimination, then these are the things we have to do. And we can look to other countries and see that this is what they do, and it clearly has an effect. It probably has a great general public health effect as well.
Well, that's a very good point you raised. You know, this year, the number of influenza cases we've had have dropped down for what would usually be around 60,000 in a month to down to about 1,000 in a month. So we've almost eliminated influenza at a time we were trying to take care of COVID. So these public health measures do actually have an impact. And one doesn't know cause and effect, but when it comes to deaths, it is remarkable that Singapore, even though it has had a very high number of cases now, something close to 40,000, has had 26 deaths. Similarly, Japan, even in Tokyo, where it's had a high number, because everyone wear masks. Now, I shouldn't say because, we don't know it is because of the masks, but it's probably a very good hypothesis. The number of deaths are also low. So you know, it's not only just the infection rate, but probably it doesn't affect the vulnerable, or the vulnerable selectively use the masks. So.
Yeah, and there's another theory that's being tested in animal models, that when you wear a mask, there obviously is some virus that comes out, but any virus, it's greatly reduced viral load, and potentially that may play a role too. Yes. I should say at the beginning of the outbreak, there was this real concern about availability of personal protective equipment, and there was a real worry about mask shortages. And I think the other piece of evidence that has changed the feasibility of universal mask wearing is cloth masks, and therefore there isn't a threat to the supply for healthcare settings.
Right. So howsoever we do roller coasters, blips, you know, elimination, the final salvation, if that's the right word, is we would need to have immunity to the virus. Now, one way of that is a vaccine. Sharon, where do we stand with respect to vaccines?
Well, the development of vaccines is moving at an unbelievably rapid pace. There is about 20 vaccines now in clinical trials. And
in human clinical
trials. There's over 150 in preclinical development, about 20 in human clinical trials. About a third of those are in China, and about 2/3 outside of China. And just yesterday, the results of one of the front runners of vaccines, a vaccine made by an American company called Moderna, supported by the National Institutes of Health. The results of their first vaccine study of 45 people were published, and that looked quite promising, actually. It was a dose-finding study.
What did they see in those 45 people? They didn't have coronavirus, did they?
No, it's a phase 1 study, so it's given to completely healthy volunteers. The most important thing they're looking for is safety, and they gave 3 doses, and at the highest dose, they found there were more side effects than the middle and the lowest dose, but minor side effects, meaning, you know, discomfort at the site of injection and non-specific symptoms. But the other thing they look at is how effective it is at inducing an immune response. And we think that the most important immune response is making antibodies. And they looked at the types of antibodies that were made, the total number, and then whether they, what we say, neutralise or kill the virus in a test tube test, and it looked pretty encouraging. 2 doses a month apart, and at the middle dose, you know, really most people made the right kind of antibodies.
So 2 doses a month apart, so you get dose 1, then you get dose 2, and how long does it take for you to get the antibodies that you need?
I think that was quite quick. I can't remember exactly how soon after the second dose they tested.
Is it days, weeks, months?
By this, I can't remember exactly that. The real big question though is how long those antibodies last.
Yes.
And so whether they last for a year, 2 years, a lifetime. So for example, after a measles vaccine, our immunity lasts a lifetime.
Right.
But we don't know that, of course. And we also actually don't really know whether this will protect from infection. And that will only be answered in what's called a phase 3 study.
Phase 3 trial. Well, that brings me to the other thing that, I mean, at one level, you read this in the newspaper and you think, great, a vaccine promised by January 21, or maybe even before the US presidential elections. And then you think, the problems will be over. There is this great longing to go back to life as it used to be. It's only natural. But is it true that even if we had what is called a successful vaccine, I'm not talking about a miracle, I'm talking about a usual successful vaccine, will the problem be over? So let's say in January 2021, Sharon, one of these phase 3 trials comes positive. We'll have a big splash in all our international newspapers, vaccine for COVID found. What happens the next day? How long does it take?
Well, the next steps, which are actually not, are actually concurrent because people are thinking about this now, is manufacturing that vaccine at scale, governments purchasing it and then delivering it to their populations. And each of those are quite big feats. And what's happening in the vaccine development space now is that many companies are already manufacturing at scale, even without knowing whether it's effective.
So they're stockpiling or building up the stocks of a vaccine.
Yeah.
They don't know if it's effective.
Yeah.
And if it isn't effective, that's just gone to waste.
Well, the economists calculate that this is worthwhile. The big concern, of course, is the rich countries can purchase and manufacture vaccines. How will we make sure there's global access to the vaccine? And, surprisingly enough, even for coronavirus, we are still seeing vaccine hesitancy. There's been some early studies looking at young people and whether there was a coronavirus vaccine available, would they have it? Surprisingly, it's not 100%. In fact, quite a big number.
And let me turn to you, Tony, from a public health point of view. Let's say we got the vaccine. It's quite reasonable to say that we won't have immediately a stockpile for everyone all over the world. But let's start with our country first. Let's say we only had 1 million doses. Who would it go to first?
That's a great question, actually. And I think there's 2 priority groups, and they're different. One is the vulnerable, the elderly, those with morbidity. You could give it to those people, or you could be giving it to the healthcare workers and those like the essential workers now who are out there and about more. Now, we haven't exactly modelled that, but I can see a case for both of those, and that's something that you would want to work out, is where you would first deploy that vaccine.
Right, and I hope that kind of work is going on. But of course, vulnerability can be defined just by age or demographics, you're saying, but also by social and socioeconomic characteristics. And the challenge, of course, is that when you reach out to the so-called marginalized groups, they're oftentimes a bit suspicious about all of this. And you can already see the stuff happening on Facebook. Cathy, do you have a sense of, what would be the acceptance of...
Well, my sense is, going back to what Sharon was saying, there's some terrific community leaders and influencers that haven't been used enough in the disaster space that this is. And it would be doing a lot of work to make sure that you're getting buy-in from influential people within communities where you would have some natural suspicions of government. And so really, doing this smarter, I think would be really important.
Cathy, you're emphasising again and again that, we've gone at it with the police. We've even got the Australian Defence Force into it. Of course, we've got public health officials into it. But what I'm sensing from you is that probably we have not, in some sense, mobilised the community influencers, especially in the sort of marginalised aspects of our community. How is that to be done?
Well, you see, I think that some of our disaster response people, whether they be the police or whether they be the army, they're not necessarily good at understanding community. That they have a control command style rather than a community style of who do we engage and how do we engage. So I think that some of that is around the basic training around disaster response, and some of it is about just, let's be really clear that these are not just vulnerable communities. They are actually, very strong communities with a lot of really good strong, influential people who are wanting to make a difference.
But Cathy, in a time when we can't even get together and meet, and everything is by Zoom, how does one organize those community influencers?
Well, I think, they're known as much as anyone else. And so that we know that when we're doing Zoom meetings, we're actually getting a bigger turn up to Zoom meetings.
That's true, then in person.
to meetings than we've ever had in face-to-face. So that actually there are ways of doing this. I mean, there is a little joke out there about, why is the coronavirus out there? Well, there's two reasons.
Okay.
One is the density of people. And the second one is the density of people.
All right. Well, we could also add to it. Yes.
To the South African example I was talking about earlier, but what they did in South Africa. So they have two major advisory groups to their government. One is science and one is community.
Wow.
So you have to elevate that level of advice. The Prime Minister currently has a business council essentially advising him. There's a number of scientific advising councils. There's an Indigenous advisory group, but we really need to elevate. And these issues around how we live and work and wear masks or not wear masks, we've got to get the communities on board. And for the same reason, they'll need it to understand why you need a vaccine and why you're getting it and who should get it. And I think it really needs to be elevated in that conversation.
And that brings us to a good point, because when we're talking about the vaccine, we're not only just interested in the protection of the individual, it's also because the vaccine, when deployed properly, reduces the rate of transmission in the entire community. And that's what's usually called the herd immunity. Now, of course, when all of this started, people thought, well, if you don't have the vaccine, let everyone get the infection, because that's another way of getting to herd immunity. So, Tony, from your point of view as a public health, what exactly is herd immunity when there is no vaccine?
All right, so herd immunity works as follows. So for something like the coronavirus, each one person on average pre-COVID times would give it to 2.5 people.
Right.
Now, using that 2.5 number, you can mathematically work out that once 60% of your population is immune, then the epidemic will fade off. So you'll get slightly more than 60% infected, but the herd immunity really kicks in. But it differs depending on how we function as society, because there's nothing God-given about 2.5 as a reproductive rate. That will go down as we change our behaviours, as we keep more physical distance, if we wear masks, that will come down. So that means that the herd immunity from either natural infection or vaccine may well be a lot less than 60% if we change how we function in society. So it's a mutable concept.
So it's not so in other words, herd immunity where everyone functions like 1995 might require 60%.
Exactly.
But if everyone starts in the Tokyo fashion, wearing face masks, keeping distance, being a bit cautious, you may only require 30, 40%, and you may still be able to tame the infection.
And it's a fascinating mathematical concept, but obviously very important now. So for example, paper in Science showing that 43% might be enough because of the way that populations mix. It's really interesting to look around the world at the moment, those countries that have had high rates of infection, they seem to be having more of a handbrake put on from, say, 20% of people being immune. And it's probably because those 20% of people who got infected were the more socially interactive. So it is a dynamic concept. It's not binary, all the way to 60%, then we're fine. So for some countries like the US, which appears to be going for something like a herd immunity strategy by stealth or chaos, they will get to a point whereby they can actually function more out there because they will have a partial handbrake on of 20 or 30% of people immune.
Right.
Now, we don't yet know really, though, that natural infection gives you immunity and for how long.
I should have mentioned that, is that there's quite a lot of... Sharon's got more expertise than me, but there's a lot of stuff happening in the immunology space at the moment with grave concerns that their immunity may not last particularly long, and that we're in a sort of an influenza type of, or even a sort of a cold type of phenomena, cold virus type of phenomena, where this immunity may not last too long, which would be quite problematic. Maybe Sharon wants to speak to that.
Well, we don't, first of all, vaccine-induced immunity we may be able to induce better immunity from a vaccine than natural immunity, and that always varies for different viruses. But yes, we don't yet know. We know that nearly everyone does make these good antibodies, neutralising antibodies. seem to be maintained over time, but there are reports that they drop down. Now that we're able to follow people now for out to 6 months, there's early reports that they may, but it's not yet clear. What we don't really know is whether those naturally induced good antibodies protect you from infection. You know, that's the unanswered question. Most likely it does, based on what we know from SARS-1 and from animal models, but it hasn't definitively been proven.
So there's a very interesting thing here, because, you know, as we were talking as well, we don't really know if the antibodies last for a year, we don't know if protection lasts for a year, and frankly, we'll never know that until we have been an year into this.
Yeah, we may answer some of those questions by better animal models. So there are some, you know, improving. We don't have ideal animal models, but they're getting better. Many of our vaccines are tested in animal models, and in some animals, the monkey model, it looks like if you make antibodies, you can protect from infection. But we will learn from both natural history as well as better animal models.
But it seems to me, whichever way it's going to go, you know, this business of lockdowns or, you know, restrictions may be with us for some period of time. Cathy, what does it mean for us as a society, and particularly for the functioning impact on women, children, people who are vulnerable otherwise?
Well, I think that what we've got to be doing is making sure that we recognise that there are inequalities here, that it hits certain groups much harder, either in terms of the corona vaccine or, in terms of the coronavirus and how it hits, or also in terms of the impact of suppression, you know, like with women being isolated, children being isolated, where you've got domestic violence, you know, so that there are inequalities that happen. So you've got to make some compensations. So it's really about how is, in a way, the government and the community going to make compensations to not leave people way behind. So, I mean, I think that that's the issue, is how is it that we're all in this together rather than there's a group that are getting protected and there's a group that are really left behind and extremely vulnerable.
Now, that brings us to the interesting issue of compensation. You know, the government has spent an astronomical amount of money in this compensation. And it would be fair to say that up till now it has been a relatively blunt instrument. Couldn't be any other way. You know, it was quick, had to go out fast. In the long run, we will not have that much more money to spend on this. So how can we get more sophisticated? Where would you target your support if you wanted to get the maximum bang for your buck?
I mean, from my view, I mean, I think one of the lessons out of this, you know, if we're looking at what have we learnt, well, you know, they doubled overnight New Start.
Right.
So that actually people, for the first time on New Start, were having 3 meals a day. Right. You know, so that actually raising New Start so that it's actually JobKeeper and not lowering it too much is, you know, a basic public health thing. Right. And actually is part of, if I was going to target anything, I'd go, there's your compensation. You've got to raise up people so that they can live at a reasonable rate. And I think also we took all the homeless people on the streets and gave them housing. And actually looking after people's housing is a real basic. And so that if you're going to really drive somewhere, you need to be thinking about how you don't leave the
very basics that you raised. I mean, it's interesting that what started off with COVID might become, in some sense, an experiment in sort of universal basic income or something like that. It wasn't,
That's a good point.
It wasn't meant to be like that, but it may become a before and after experiment. Does universal basic income work? But anyway, it's time to bring this to a close, but I do want to bring it to a close on a note of hope, even though we are locked down. And for the moment, things sometimes do look bleak. But I'm sure there is hope in all of this. So when you look at all of this, Sharon, the science, the community response, how we work as a country, as a world, where do you find hope in all of this?
Well, I find hope in a greater awareness about the public good. So all of us going out, wearing masks, respecting social distancing, even when we're young, fit and healthy, is about your contribution to the greater public good. And I think that will be a very powerful lesson from coronavirus, and gives me some hope that that alone could make a big difference.
Massively. I should clarify on that note that as we walked in, we were all wearing masks. Our cameramen and recordists out there are wearing masks, so we are observing the very best of this. So we are, in some sense, you know, walking the talk, not just talking that. From your point of view, Tony, where do you find hope in all of this?
Global and local. Global, we know things like world wars, not wanting to catastrophize too much, but they do cause a greater sense of equality after that,
Yes.
a realization that people are in this together, even if it's only through the mechanism of enlightened self-interest. I need to look after the poor because that's where the virus might come back to me. So I see hope globally that this will change financial structures and things like that to result in a more equal society for a while. Local, we have the opportunity down here at the bottom of the world to actually stand back and watch what happens and learn from the rest of the world. That's a kind of enlightened self-interest. And we have the possibility for keeping the virus very low or even going for elimination to allow us time to see what works best in the science. Is it a combination of natural infection and a vaccine? What type of mechanisms? And one thing we haven't talked about today is where is the research happening on how to protect the elderly? We've got the trials on the vaccine, on the treatments. But what about trials about rest homes and how one protects the elderly when this virus inevitably does come back?
That might be a next episode. Cathy, where do you find hope?
I mean, I think like with Sharon and Tony, there is something about we're all in this together, and that recognising that actually we are a society, no matter what Maggie Thatcher tried to tell us, we are a society, and that if you leave people behind, it will kick back on everybody, that we need to bring everybody along together. And I think we've had some really good examples there. I think the other thing is less pollution, you know, and that actually climate change is a really big crisis that's with us as well as looming.
Well, this is not how we meant to solve it, but it is true. We are having a positive impact.
You know, there's no all those planes out of the skies, less traffic in the streets, all those sorts of things. Actually, you can breathe the air.
It does tell us that we can have an impact on climate too. So look, with that, it's time to bring this discussion to a close. Please join me in thanking our wonderful experts. This has been a one-off episode designed to bring you an evidence-based view of the current environment and we find ourselves in. Well, your continuing interest has been a delight. So thank you for all of those who reached out to us and wanted to hear more. If you want to see any of our past episodes, the link here will show you where you can find it. Until then, I've stopped saying this is the last episode because frankly, I can't predict the COVID virus anymore. I thought the last one was the last episode. But in any case, keep safe, stay well, until we can shake hands again, a namaste to you.